Welcome to Authors Alcove for Fantasy Writers. This is episode 43, which means we only have 10 left in the entire Story Savvy self editing series, where Rebecca, my development editor and friend, who works with heartboundediting.com, if you're interested, is helping me self edit my good story into a great one. If you haven't already, I encourage you to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can also join the Authors Alcove community on Patreon or check out the membership site at authorsalcove.com. Last week, we went over avoiding and fixing exposition and info dump. Today, we're going to do the first of two episodes specifically about self-editing around names every writer should know and do.
I'm happy to be here as always, and I'm excited to tackle the topic of names in fiction, specifically introductions and choices around names for this week. By the end of this episode, you will hopefully feel confident tackling these edits in your writing process, or at least the first half of these edits, since we are going to spread it out over 2 episodes.
So, to kick things off, why are we doing two whole episodes on names? Are we just talking about character names here, or what are we actually talking about?
We are doing 2 whole episodes on this because it is a really tangible step in the polishing of a story, and the list of questions that I suggest writers ask themselves and apply is pretty long. So, to avoid unnecessary overwhelm for anyone, I'm going to split that list roughly in half over 2 episodes to leave room for any clarifying questions that end up coming up. And no, we are not just talking about character names here. In this conversation on names, we are also talking about place names, titles, and everything else like that. Like I just mentioned, I have a comprehensive checklist that I suggest writers go through on this topic and ask themselves each question, and then do whatever research within their own story or make any changes that feel productive and needed from that. The first question that I suggest you ask yourself is number one, am I asking the reader to learn more than 3 new names in any given scene?
Three.
3 new names in a chapter is generally the most that a reader can really memorize, I guess I'll say here. If you're asking a character to remember too many new names, be that character names or place names or a combination thereof, in one chapter, it's more likely that they're going to forget one of those or a couple or get them mixed up in their head and muddled together in some kind of way. You want each of your places and your characters to remain very distinct for your readers, and giving them a good chunk of content and context for the name to get their teeth into before asking them to learn the name of the next thing is very helpful in that. So you don't want to overwhelm with too many names in one chapter, and 3 is just kind of an easy number to work with there. Point number 2, or question number 2 to ask yourself from this list is, am I providing interpersonal context, like I was just talking about, and a memorable characteristic trait with each of those introductions? When you give someone a name, do you give them something to go, oh, right, that character is the one who is in this role or has this title or looks like this, and oh, that place name, that's the pub where the protagonist works, something like that. You need to give them context.
So, what exactly does interpersonal context mean here?
So, interpersonal context is going to be titles such as, okay, well, Linda is the protagonist's mother. Okay, that's interpersonal context. Or Haley is the protagonist's rival in the school, something like that. Interpersonal context is just saying who this other character is to the other characters, brother, sister, boss, coworker, things like that. So the third question to ask yourself on the list is, are any characters who only show up in the second half of the story at least hinted at existing or being relevant at some point in the first half? You don't want to introduce characters in the second half, so doing a check to see where they first come up and then making sure that they are at least mentioned in abstract in the first half can be important for feeling established and built up and not like something that comes out of left field in the part of the story where things should start more building up and wrapping up than being established.
So why is this a no-no?
It's so in the second half of a story, if you start trying to introduce new things, it can just throw your readers off. In the second half of a story, just based on our experience as readers and consuming stories throughout our lives, we expect that everything we need to know for the story has already been sort of established and set up. We have that first half foundation, and the second half is just supposed to be about using what has been created and building that into something that can have a payoff in the climax and then the resolution. When you introduce a new character in the second half, that can feel at the basis level just kind of like, where's this person coming from? This feels weird. And at a perhaps more extreme level, like Deus Ex Machina, which if you think it's going to be that extreme, I refer you back to the episode on that topic. So yeah. And then fourth fourth question to ask yourself on my list here is for any genre, but especially historical, have I checked that my names are appropriate and a good fit for the time period, location, culture, age of the character, societal status, and religion of that character? Have I made sure that I'm not contributing to any harmful stereotypes or typecasting with my name choices? Such as, the villains having very ethnic names, while the protagonists and their friends all have classic European names. And if not, if I have not avoided these stereotypes, can I cover that issue by directly addressing and naming how this is coming across or perhaps impacting these characters the first time that name is used or introduced, that sort of thing?
So how does this apply to fantasy where we get to kind of invent the rules around that sort of thing from the ground up?
It is definitely squishier, but I would still suggest thinking about that. And if you want to play with it, come up with your own rule set around it. If you have an invented religion in your world, what names are associated with that religion? Like names like Mary and Joseph and, Joshua or Sarah might be associated with Christianity in the real world. And same sort of thing for ages and societal status. Do only rich people in your world have last names? That's got real world precedent. Maybe that's a thing. And whatever rules you come up with for your story, I suggest that first you just check it for consistency across the board. Try not to have any exceptions to your own rules. And then second, make sure that these rules that you are setting up aren't going to become a sensitivity issue, which again, we've already done an episode on that. So if you're wanting to go back to that topic or revisit it, go back to that episode. So the fifth point on our list here is, sorry, the question to ask yourself is, if this book that you're working on right now is a later book in a series, have I double checked that I didn't already name the character something else in an earlier book? This is on the list because I've done this. And I changed the character's name and I had to like go back and like republish the book on Amazon. It was a mess. So the sort of the follow-up question to ask yourself there is if they aren't a big part of that past book or however many books ago, um, do I need to treat their first appearance in this book like it is a brand new introduction? If this is an ongoing central character, it's fine to just bring them up again. But if they haven't been super relevant up to that point, it can be a really good idea to make sure that the first time this character is introduced in this book, it feels like you're introducing them to the reader like it's the first time they've ever seen the name.
So how can I know which names to check or where? What if I already mentioned a character in an earlier book?
So that's essentially what happened to me. I forgot that I already mentioned this character by name in book one when she came up in book, I can't even remember, it was like three or four. What I suggest that you do is essentially make a list, which we'll go into a lot more detail on later. But when in doubt, try just searching. Hopefully, you've got all of your previous books in some sort of searchable document. And just before you get too far with the current book later in the series, go into each of those books and search every name you have ever thought of that character being. So if, let's say, you originally named a character Bob, but that was just a placeholder name, and by book 5 in the series or whatever you're working on, his name has changed to Dominic, something like that, then you need to search all of the previous books for both Bob and Dominic and any other in between name that you possibly ever called him, to make sure that you have not previously named him something else. So point number 6 in my list here to ask yourself is, the first time I use a given place name, am I clear about whether it is a continent, a kingdom, a, a country, a county, a region, a state, a city, a town, or something else? Is it clear what, you know, Mordor is if you had no context yet to know what or where a Mordor was?
So where exactly is the line like, okay, I'm so sorry, I started coughing and I didn't end up reading what I needed to read. So where exactly is the line like that, like if I mention the Enchanted Forest in a fantasy, do I have to clarify exactly where and what that is, or only if I give a different name to an area that is functionally also an enchanted forest?
The context in which you mention it for the first time can be very helpful. So if you're saying, hey, I need you to walk through the Enchanted Forest to go visit so and so, that's pretty clear. You can probably just leave it at face value there. But it is important to remember that in this world, the reader doesn't know. Maybe you have a pub called the Enchanted Forest. So when you say you're going to go to the Enchanted Forest, you mean you're going to go drink some pints with your buddies. So just pay attention and give thought to whether or not it is clear and accurate to someone who has no idea what's to come the first time you mention something. It's really kind of case by case, but it's worth mentioning and checking every single time the first use of a place name to make sure that it is understandable. And if you have something kind of confusing, like let's say a hotel named, the Pine Mountain, that it's clear that it's a hotel and not a mountain covered in pine trees. I hope that makes sense. So, the next question to ask yourself on the list is, if any of my characters go by multiple names, that could be a first and a last name, a first name that their friends call them, and a middle name that their parents call them, anything like that, or have multiple titles or labels and a name, do I clearly introduce them all by all of those names and titles the first time? So if you have someone who has a first, middle, and last name and a religious title and a military title and a government title, it's gonna be a lot, and I don't actually suggest that you do that, but if you insist on doing that, try to use all 3 words the first time you introduce this character. Introduce them as James Michael Smith, Father General, whatever, the first time, so that the reader immediately knows, oh, all of those refer to this one person. Okay, cool. And then the follow-up questions within this question are, can I reduce the number of names and or titles that they go by to a bare minimum that the story needs to function, because that will help your readers? And then can I make those aspects unique to them? Do I use all of those names or nicknames or titles often and memorably enough for the reader to keep track that they all refer to the same character? So, a little bit of clarity on that one. If you only call, let's say, your villain the general twice in the whole book, by the second use, the reader's probably going to go, "Wait, what general? Wait, is that talking about Mr. Smith? Is that the same person?" So you want to make sure that if you insist on using many titles or many names, those get used regularly and memorably throughout so that the reader can keep track as they go through. And then lastly, I'm trying to check my notes here a little bit. If I search for every single one of those names or titles, is each use of it clear about who is speaking and acting? So again, if in a chapter I say the general gave orders, is it clear that it is General Smith, that specific character? Since this checklist is getting so long at this point, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is enough for this week of self-editing. We're gonna do the rest of the list next week, and yeah, hopefully this has given people plenty of homework to do for the moment.
Since you're done giving your checklist for now, I did want to ask one last question. So, I'm one of the biggest turnoffs I have in epic fantasy, which is funny because that's what I write, which I think others, this is something that others really love, is having really long, complicated names. I can't tell if I'm just the wrong target audience for these books because if I pick up a book and it has a bunch of names that I cannot pronounce in my head, I will put it back. Is this something people should be wary of, or is this actually a target audience type thing?
I think it's entirely a target audience thing. I have I tend to lean on the side with you where I prefer simpler names and concepts and stuff because I'm here for the plot, not for the world building, or less for the world building. But high fantasy in general as a genre loves that stuff. And I'm totally into it when I get clients coming to me with I've had, dictionaries sent to me for all of their unique world building words and pronunciation guides for the names. And there is absolutely a fantastically large, enthusiastic audience for that. So whatever floats your boat, go for it. The one thing that I will say here is try to pick one or the other consistently. So don't have one character named Bob and one named, a 5-syllable fantasy name you made up. That's just going to be jarring to the reader and it's going to be weird and confusing. So if you want to go long fantasy word type of fantasy, commit to it. And if you don't, try to keep them all relatively short and simple. Obviously, there's exceptions if, you start out as low fantasy and then fantasy creatures come into your world kind of thing. But whatever you want to do there, just choose it and do it intentionally.
I love when you're telling these things because I always think of authors who break these rules so well. Because one of my favorite authors of all time is Jasper Ford because he is so absurd. Like he is absurd. So he can get away with doing like breaking certain rules because his stories are just ridiculous. And I love it.
And
But
it's great to have this reminder every once in a while that there are exceptions to every rule. My job is just to establish the rules for the newer authors who still need to learn how to follow them before they advance into breaking them. So I'm very glad you mentioned that.
I just think it's funny 'cause I was picturing him writing, like purposely having all these complicated names and then having a Bob. And he would do it and it would pull up and it would come off really well and everybody would find it really funny. Anyway, thank you so much for all of your insight. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Next week, we will go over consistency and regulation around the names to finish out the second half of this topic. And as always, I would like to thank everyone who listens and watches and follows along with this series. If you know any authors who are nearing the end of their first draft or struggling with revising or rewriting their novel, then please send them this podcast, give them a little bit of help there, and yeah, the more folks that we can get understanding self-editing and doing it better, I think that'll be great for the author world. So here we go.
And I can't wait to hear the rest of this checklist because I'm very curious what you have on it. Thank you.